Yo book nerds, I finished my reread of Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins. I enjoyed this read. I didn't remember a ton of it from my first read, so a lot of it I was like, I read this? I don't remember reading it, but it's been like 10 plus years. So it makes sense that I didn't remember much of it, but at the same time, I enjoyed myself on this reread. However, I feel like with this book being the last of the series, I was hoping it would have packed a little more punch at the very end. There was definitely a lot of action leading up to the ending, a lot of suspense, and then the ending happened and I was just kind of left wanting a little more. But that said, I still think it was a very good book, and if you're into the Hunger Games, you should definitely read it. So what is Mockingjay all about? Well, Panem is in full-blown civil war. The rebellion is in full swing. And Katniss is trying to help the rebels take down the Capitol. I really don't want to say much more than that because it will spoil things. I will say that this is the only Hunger Games book that doesn't have like an official games in it. There are definitely game-like elements in this book, but there are no official games. So if you're reading the books because you enjoy the different games, you're not going to get the games in here. This book had some other things that have bothered me in other books, like Collins's use of sentence fragments way too much. They're on every page almost. Like, they're frequent and most of the time unnecessary, and sometimes it made the writing a little choppy, but maybe that's just the English teacher in me. But I've had issues with that with other books, so it wasn't just this book. I think that that is just Collins' style, and maybe it doesn't bother you. We do get the continuation of the love triangle between Katniss, Peeta, and Gale. So I'm not a fan of love triangles. I'm a grown-ass woman. I don't care about reading teen romance. Like, I don't. So it's there. Just so you know, it's still there. I feel like this is making it all sound very negative. But again, I had a good time reading this book. I just had some things that I think could have been better. But I do still stand by my statement from the last books in the trilogy. I said, I think you should read the prequels first, and I stand by that statement. I think it adds so much to what happens in this book. So I want to talk about what I think it adds. So spoiler alert, because I'm going to assume that you have read the prequels and have read the other books in the series, and I am going to spoil things in this book as I talk about my justification for it. So, spoiler alert, just telling you. Throughout this whole book, the Hanging Tree song is repeated bits and pieces, and at one point Katniss talks about how that song has been outlawed, it's forbidden, and they're not supposed to be singing it. And we know why. We get that from the prequels. We know that Snow knows that song and it's been outlawed. And we know the whole backstory of that song being the song that Lucy Gray wrote. So it's really cool to have that kind of like Easter egg, because otherwise it's just like, oh, it's just a song. But if you have that whole prequel background, like, you understand just what that song means. Speaking of Snow, there is talk in this book about how Snow likes to poison people that don't agree with him, and we get a taste of that in the prequels when we find out he has poisoned someone, and he's poisoned himself to kind of like cover it up. Like, they poisoned some, I think it was oysters, and Snow ate of the oysters and got sick himself, and the other person died, but Snow got the antidote. So like, like we get to actually see that. So in this book, they just mention these things, but we actually know for a fact, we've seen him do it in other books. I want to talk about Haymitch, and I think we get more of Haymitch's story, and he talks about what happens to his family after his games. Like he tells Katniss that his family was killed, and he kind of like opens her eyes to the fact that you never win the games. The government is always controlling you, or they hurt the ones you care about. And so Haymitch and Finnick kind of open Katniss's eyes to that. And yeah, you never actually win the games. You're just not poor anymore. But Haymitch tells Katniss like that Snow killed his whole family because of what he did with the force field, which is true, but it's also not true if you've read the sequels. So it doesn't match up perfectly, because we know he did a bunch of sabotage, and that's the real reason why his family was killed, was all of his conniving ways throughout his whole game. So you could kind of write that off though by saying like maybe he just didn't want to open up fully to Katniss. He just didn't want to open that wound and like fully admit how much he did that put his family at risk. So I mean, I still think it does connect. That leads me to talk about Katniss's motivation. From the very beginning of the original trilogy, Katniss is motivated to protect Prim. She volunteers to take her place in the reaping. Like she wants to keep Prim safe always. So Haymitch, saying like they will hurt your family, like that has meaning to Katniss. She doesn't want Prim to get hurt. Katniss has other motivations to join the rebels and fight, yes, but her biggest motivation is Prim. There's a scene where she talks about how like she could see Prim actually becoming a doctor someday, which never would have been possible without the rebellion, because doctors weren't a thing in the districts, like people just died. And so like the fact that Prim could actually be trained and actually become a doctor is like amazing to her. So like she has stakes in keeping Prim alive and giving her the best life. Now, again, spoiler alert, because I'm going to spoil the ending. Prim, unfortunately, does die in this book. I did not remember that, I'm going to be honest, and it caught me off guard. And it, like, I felt Katniss's pain. It was really well written and tragic. And Haymitch, when it happens, he, like, goes back to drinking. And I think, like, we could say, like, Haymitch goes back to drinking because he's just a drunk, but if you know what happened to his family, it definitely could be very triggering. The way Prim dies in this book, it involves fire, and Haymitch's family died in a fire, and it's just a horrific death, and it definitely could have been very triggering for Haymitch and could have led him back to drinking. I think it's very cruel irony that Prim does die, because everything started in motion because Katniss was trying to protect Prim. Katniss would have never been in the games, would have never won the games, would have never been a thorn in Snow's side. None of it would have ever happened if Prim weren't around and if Katniss were not trying to protect her from the very beginning. So the fact that she dies in this book and Katniss fails at protecting her, like, that is very, very cruel irony, and it makes for a very tragic ending. I also did not remember how Finnick dies in this book. That took me by surprise. Like, I knew he did die, but I forgot how gruesome it was, and that affected me when I was reading. Even though there aren't official games in this book, it certainly feels that way, because in the war there are mutts, there are horrible like traps that protect the capital, and people are dying, people you care about, and it definitely still feels like the games are going on. There are a couple like scenes I want to talk about. Katniss is getting some training at one point, and she's like doing these like fake scenarios. They call it being on the block, where the scenarios are like not real, but they're acting out these scenarios with weapons. They're like, they just have blanks in their guns, like, and Katniss says like that it's very realistic even though it's not real. There's a line that says, part of you knows it's fake and that they're not going to kill you, but if you set off a landmine, you hear the explosion and have to pretend to fall over dead. But in other ways, it feels pretty real in there. The enemy soldiers dressed in peacekeepers' uniforms, the confusion of a smoke bomb, they even gas us. So it's all very realistic. And that made me think of something I just recently did for work. I had to do something called Alice training. We had to like act out an active shooter situation. And even though it was all fake, it felt very realistic. My adrenaline was going, my heart rate was up. It was very intense. And the fact that I live in Minnesota, and like a week after I did this training, we had the tragedy at Annunciation Catholic school, Catholic church. Like it all hits very close to home, and it's a tragedy, and I'm so sorry for the people that have passed away and those that are injured. But the fact that like I'm getting a little off topic here, but the fact that Katniss says that this was realistic, this training, like I was just in training that felt very realistic, so I can relate. And then something horrific happens, and I hope that nothing like it happens again. Anyway, back to the story. Sorry for the little tangent, but that really resonated with me. I did love seeing Tigress pop back up. We haven't really seen her or heard of her since the first prequel, and it just puts an interesting spin on her helping them since we know her backstory. Looking for one more quote I wanted to share. The quote goes, "Because something is significantly wrong with a creature that sacrifices its children's lives to settle its differences." And that just really struck me, especially with everything going on. Like, we need to protect our children. They're innocent. They're innocent in everything. And it just resonated with me. Like I said, the ending just did not pack the punch I was hoping. We've been with Snow since the first prequel. This is 5 books of Snow being the bad guy. And then the way he dies, like, there's a twist, and that creates some intrigue, like, for sure. But then Snow just kind of, like, dies on his own. Like, it was very, Snow's actual death was very anticlimactic for me. And I really wanted to see some, like, comeuppance, like, some revenge, some retribution. And I feel like I didn't get that. I also just think that the way things end for Katniss, she's just kind of written off as crazy, and she's really a hero, and it just felt very anticlimactic in the end for me. It does end, like, it's a tragic ending, but there is this feeling of hope. I didn't really like the epilogue, but it is what it is. Like, there's this feeling of hope, things are going to get better, and so, like, that's all good. The ending didn't pack the punch I was hoping. Anyway, that is my review of Mockingjay. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. We can chat there. I say it's still worth the read. It just is definitely not my favorite book in the series, and I think it could have had a stronger ending. But don't skip it. I wouldn't skip it. I definitely don't think it's a bad book. Anyway, that is Mockingjay. I hope you are having a lovely week, and I will talk to you next Monday. Hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks for talking books with me.